This is just going to be a quick walkthrough for the code behind the Google Calendars lab. So first I'm just going to show off the code for the server. So this is just going to be done in Node.js, and I'm going to be using the Express framework to receive all of the GET requests. And I'm going to be using this NEDB library to do the database storing. So it's going to be an in-memory database that you can then persist to the disk. So first here I'm just going to listen on port 1275, and then I'm going to set up the data store and tell it to auto load from the hard disk if it can, and to use this data file here. And then we're going to start setting up the endpoints that we're going to use. So the first one here is add info. So that's going to be to add a new user to the system. So each user is going to have a username, and they're going to have a calendar ID and a token associated with them. And so here we're just going to get each one of those properties that are going to be passed into the URL for the GET request. And so next we're just going to make sure that they passed us all of the required arguments. And if they haven't, we're going to send back a 400 error telling them that the arguments are invalid. And then we're going to set up this object. It's going to contain all of the things that they just passed into us. And then we're just going to insert it into the database and send back to the user the object that we just created. And then our next endpoint here is going to be for the info. So that's going to allow the user to grab some information from the server. And so in here we're going to use the database's find one method and pass it the user's username. And so if it couldn't find anything for that username, we're going to send back a 404 error saying that it couldn't be found. But if it could, we're going to try and parse the expiration date from the database and make sure that that's before the current date, so that the access token is still valid. If it's invalid, we're going to send back another 404 saying the token expired. But if everything went all right, we're just going to send back that entire document. Okay, so now I'm going to show the client side of this project. And before I do anything else, I'm just going to run it to show that it works and to show exactly what the endpoint that we're going to be striving for is here. So first I'm just going to start the server, and then I'm going to run the project, and I'm going to create a new username, and it's going to try and do OAuth here. So I'm going to take the code that it responded with and paste it back into the runner. And then next I'm going to put in a user that's already signed into the system in the past. So I'm going to put in my username. And then I'm going to press N because I'm done with that. And then I'm going to put in a date. So I'm going to put in August 31st and run that. And it's going to show all of the dates that either of the users or both of them are busy. And for this date, it just happens to be just this one day. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through the client-side code here. So the first thing that we're going to do in this calendar class is just define our client, secret client ID, and the server URL. And then in main, the first thing that we're going to do is set up this JSON array that's going to hold all of the users that are going to be logged into this client. And then we're going to in a while loop, we're going to prompt for username, and then if that username equals n, we're just going to break out of this loop because that's the quit command. And then we're going to try and get that username from the server using this getURL method, which is just going to do a GET request. And we're going to use this info endpoint, passing it in the username. If that fails, if the user didn't exist or his access token is expired, we're just going to get sent to this catch clause. But if it was successful, we're just going to add the result of that to our user's object. So if it is a new user, in this catch clause, we're going to authorize the user using this authorize method. So in here, we're just going to use this OAuth endpoint from the Google APIs and set up this map that's going to contain all of the OAuth credentials. And then we're going to assemble a URL from that using this add parameters. And then we're going to request that that gets opened in the user's browser. But if for whatever reason it couldn't be opened, we're just going to tell them to go there manually. So now we have to prompt them for whatever showed up in the browser. So we're using this prompt command, and once we have that access token, well, once we have that input, we're going to use this get token method to get the access token using this token endpoint. This is going to be a post request, so we have to create a map that's going to contain all of our authorization parameters, and then we're going to use this HTTP URL connection on that token URL. We're going to add all of our parameters to it, make it a post request, and then we're going to execute it here. And then, no, we're actually going to execute it down here, sorry. And then we're going to parse the result into a JSON object, and we're going to grab the expiration date and the access token from there, and we're going to pass those back in the form of a string array. And so once we have both of those, we can then get a list of the calendars using this get calendars method, which is going to call the calendar list endpoint. So we're just going to assemble a URL that's going to contain the access token, and we're just going to execute that as a GET request, and then we're going to parse the result into a JSON object and get the items object from there and return it. And once we have that JSON array, we're going to loop through the calendars, and we're going to grab the primary calendar from there, and then we're going to save that ID into calendar ID. And now that we have that calendar ID, we're going to assemble this map. It's going to contain all the parameters that we need to send to the server. And so once we have those parameters, we're going to execute another GET request to the server using this add info. So we're adding another user to our server. And we're going to parse the result from the servers and save it in this users object. At this point, we should have a JSON array that's going to hold all of these users objects. So down here, we're going to create another scanner, and we're going to prompt the user to enter a date in this format here. And then we're going to use this get free busy to query the Google Calendars API using this free busy endpoint. And we're going to pass it in the API key as a URL parameter. And this is going to be a post request here, so we need to assemble a JSON object that holds all of our properties. So we're going to enter the parent object, we're going to put a time minimum and a time maximum, and then we're going to assemble a child JSON array that's going to hold the ID of each calendar, and then we're going to add that child array to the parent and call it items. And then we're going to create this HTTP URL connection, and we're going to set its authorization to use a bearer token. And then we're going to signify that we're going to be using JSON for this. And then we're just going to set up the rest of the post request. And then we're going to get the output stream from that URL connection, and we're going to write the JSON array to that output stream. And then next we're going to try and execute that connection using this connection.getInputStream. And then if that was successful, we're going to get the results as a buffered reader. And we're going to pass the buffered reader to the JSON parser and get back a JSON object. And we're going to return that JSON object. So now that we have that, where were we? Sorry. Okay, so now we're going to take the result and we're going to get the calendars array. And we're going to get that back as a JSON object. And then we're going to set up this events array list that's going to hold all of the events for each calendar. And we're going to set up this simple date format that we're going to use for parsing the dates that we get from Google. And next we're just going to loop over all of the users that are signed in, and we're going to grab each of those calendar IDs, and then we're going to get the busy schedule for each of those calendars. and we're going to get that back as a JSON array, and we're going to loop over that JSON array. And then we're going to grab the start and end time for each of those events, and we're going to parse it into a date object. And then next we have to add it to this events things, but we also don't want any overlap from multiple different calendars. So, and we also want these to be listed in chronological order. So we have to loop over them here, and here we're just going to check and make sure that it's not conflicting with anything else in our list. If it is, we're going to set this conflict boolean to true. And down here, if there was a conflict, if there was not a conflict, we're going to add it to that list. So if it's the very first item to be added, we're just going to simply add it. For all the other ones, we're going to loop through the events and we're going to add it to the appropriate place in the list. Okay, so now we should have all of the events in a list, and now all that's left is to print them out to the console. So we're simply going to loop over each event, and we're going to print out the start and end point separated by a dash. And that should just be about all for this project. Thank you for watching.